Most people imagine revenge as something loud and dramatic. They picture shouting, arguments, maybe even some kind of elaborate confrontation where someone finally gets put in their place. But the truth is, the most satisfying revenge I've ever experienced happened without a single raised voice. No insults, no dramatic speeches, just one perfectly timed moment in the middle of a crowded London Underground station, where someone who thought they were being clever suddenly realized they had made a very expensive mistake. And the best part? She walked straight into it herself. If you've ever watched someone break the rules, cut in front of everyone, and act like the system doesn't apply to them, then you're going to enjoy this story. Because sometimes karma doesn't take months or years to show up. Sometimes it arrives just a few train stops later. So before we jump into it, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and settle in. Because this might be one of the most quietly satisfying revenge moments you'll hear today. Yesterday morning started like most workdays in London. Fast, crowded, and just slightly more stressful than it really needed to be. The city has a way of waking up all at once. One moment the streets are calm, and the next moment they're filled with thousands of people rushing toward offices, meetings, trains, and buses, all moving with the same determined urgency. I was traveling for work that day, which meant my commute was a little heavier than usual. In one hand, I was pulling a medium-sized rolling suitcase, and on my shoulder hung a laptop bag that already felt heavier than it should have been. I had spent the morning in a meeting across the city, and the next step in my schedule involved catching the Eurostar later that afternoon. Missing that train wasn't really an option, so my entire day had that quiet background pressure of timing everything perfectly. By the time I reached the Underground station, the usual rush hour chaos was in full swing. People poured down the staircases in waves, escalators carried long lines of commuters downward into the tiled tunnels, and the distant sound of arriving trains echoed through the station like metal thunder. The air carried that familiar mixture of cool underground air, faint electrical smells from the tracks, and the constant murmur of hundreds of conversations happening at once. Anyone who has spent time in London knows the rhythm of this environment. People don't waste time. They move quickly, efficiently, and most importantly, they queue. It's almost an unspoken cultural rule. No matter how busy things get, people form lines and wait their turn. Because I had a suitcase with me, I headed toward the wider ticket gate, the accessibility barrier designed for people with luggage, strollers, or wheelchairs. There were already a couple of people ahead of me doing exactly the same thing. One man had 2 heavy duffel bags slung over his shoulders, and another traveler was pulling a large suitcase almost identical to mine. So, naturally, I slowed down and joined the line behind them. It was a simple moment of quiet patience, the kind that happens 1,000 times every day in a city like this. Nobody said anything. We all just waited, and then she appeared. She came from my left side, walking quickly, pulling a bright turquoise trolley suitcase behind her. It was actually the color that made me notice her first. In a sea of black coats, gray bags, and dark winter clothing, that suitcase stood out immediately. It was glossy, almost shiny under the station lights, the kind of color that practically glowed against the dull tones around it. The girl herself looked to be in her early 20s, dressed casually but neatly, with the confident energy of someone who was clearly in a hurry. Without slowing down, she stepped directly in front of me. No apology, no eye contact, not even a quick, "Excuse me." She simply inserted herself into the space ahead of me as if she had been there all along. For a split second, I blinked in surprise. It wasn't a huge offense, technically speaking. People cut lines sometimes. London is busy, and occasionally someone slips ahead without realizing it. But something about the way she did it felt different. There was no hesitation in her movement, no glance back to check whether anyone minded. She just assumed the position like it was completely natural. Now, I could have said something. A simple, "Sorry, there's a queue," would have been enough. But anyone who lives in London understands the strange social rule that often takes over in moments like that. You don't confront strangers unless absolutely necessary. Instead, you perform the classic British response, a quiet internal complaint, combined with a slightly judgmental sigh. So that's exactly what I did. I exhaled slowly, rolled my eyes ever so slightly, and thought to myself, well, that was rude. But then things got more interesting. The line moved forward. The first traveler tapped his card against the reader and rolled his luggage through the wide gate. The barrier opened smoothly, then closed behind him with its usual soft mechanical click. The second traveler did the same thing, tapping in and pushing through without any problem. Then it was the girl's turn. Except, she didn't reach for a card. She didn't slow down. Instead, she did something that has unfortunately become more common in big cities. The moment the gate opened for the traveler in front of her, she stepped forward quickly and slipped through. The barrier right behind him before it had time to close. No ticket, no tap, no payment, just a quick practice tailgate through the system. It happened in less than 2 seconds. The man ahead of her didn't even notice. By the time the barrier closed again, she was already walking away, pulling that bright turquoise suitcase confidently behind her as if nothing unusual had happened. I watched the whole thing in mild disbelief. Fare dodging on the underground isn't unheard of, but there was something particularly bold about doing it so openly, right in front of a line of people. It wasn't even the lost ticket price that annoyed me. It was the attitude behind it. That quiet assumption that the rules applied to everyone else, but not to her. Still, what was I going to do? Chase after her? Call her out in the middle of a crowded station? Realistically, none of that was worth the effort. So I stepped forward when my turn came, tapped my card against the reader, heard the familiar electronic beep of approval, and walked through the gate like a normal, rule-following commuter. Bye. The time I looked up again, she had disappeared into the crowd, and honestly, I thought that was the end of it. Just another mildly annoying moment in a busy city. But 3 stops later, everything changed, because when I stepped off the train at my destination and started heading toward the exit barriers, I saw something very familiar. That same bright turquoise suitcase, and right behind me, matching my pace almost perfectly, was the girl who hadn't paid to get in, and suddenly, for the first time that morning, an idea began forming in my mind. The train ride itself had been uneventful, the kind of short underground journey that blurs together with hundreds of others you've taken before. I stood near the doors with one hand gripping the overhead rail, and the other resting on the handle of my suitcase, gently swaying with the motion of the carriage as it rattled through the tunnels beneath London. Around me were the usual characters of a weekday commute, tired professionals scrolling through their phones, a couple quietly discussing work emails, and one man who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days staring blankly at the advertisement panel above the doors. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks created that familiar metallic soundtrack that every London commuter knows by heart. For the most part, my mind drifted toward the rest of my schedule. I had already begun mentally organizing the afternoon ahead, getting to the station in time, checking in for the Eurostar, finding my seat, maybe even grabbing a coffee before boarding. The kind of small logistical planning that fills the brain when you're trying to stay on top of a busy workday. By the time the train slowed into my destination station, I was already shifting my suitcase slightly forward, ready to step off. As soon as the doors opened, the familiar electronic chime sounded. The doors slid apart, and the small crowd inside the carriage flowed outward onto the platform like water spilling from a glass. I stepped out with them, adjusting the strap of my laptop bag on my shoulder and glancing briefly at the signs pointing toward the station exits. The platform was busy but not overwhelmingly crowded, just the steady stream of people making their way toward escalators and corridors that would lead them back up into the city streets above. As I began walking toward the exit gates, something caught my eye in the corner of my vision, a flash of bright turquoise. At first, it didn't fully register. My brain simply noticed the color before my attention shifted properly toward it. But then I looked again, and there it was. The same glossy turquoise suitcase rolling across the platform just a few meters away from me. The color was unmistakable. In a station filled with neutral tones and dark luggage, it stood out like a bright marker on a blank page, and right behind that suitcase was the same girl. For a moment, I just stared at her in mild surprise. London is a massive city, and the underground network is even larger. The odds of boarding the same train as someone you briefly saw earlier are actually fairly small unless you happen to be traveling in the same direction. Apparently, that morning, she and I were headed to the same station. She didn't notice me at first. She was walking slightly behind me, dragging the turquoise suitcase with one hand while scrolling through her phone with the other. Her expression was calm, relaxed even, like someone who had absolutely nothing to worry about. And why would she? As far as she knew, she had successfully slipped through the entry barrier without paying, boarded her train, and made it several stops across the city without a single consequence. For a moment, I considered simply ignoring the whole thing. After all, it technically wasn't my problem. The Underground deals with fare dodgers every day, and most commuters simply mind their own business. But as we moved together with the flow of people heading toward the station exit, I noticed something interesting. She was adjusting her pace. Specifically, she was adjusting it to match mine. I slowed slightly as the crowd thickened near the escalator. She slowed too. I picked up speed again once the corridor widened. A few seconds later, I could hear the faint rolling sound of her suitcase wheels right behind mine. That was when it clicked. She hadn't paid to get in, and she clearly had no ticket to get out, which meant she was planning to do the exact same thing again, tailgate someone through the exit barrier. And judging by the way she was hovering just behind me, there was a very good chance she had chosen me as her unwitting accomplice. I have to admit, the realization made something inside me shift slightly. Not anger exactly. More like a quiet, simmering irritation that had been slowly building since the moment she cut in front of me earlier. It wasn't just about the fare anymore. It was about the assumption behind it. The casual expectation that someone else would, unknowingly, help her cheat the system again. We reached the top of the escalator and followed the crowd toward the exit gates. The station corridor opened into the familiar line of ticket barriers, each one flashing green lights as commuters tapped their cards and passed through. Because I still had my suitcase with me, I headed once again toward the wider accessibility gate on the far side. It was the easiest path through when you had luggage, and just like earlier that morning, there were already a couple of people moving toward it. And right behind me, the turquoise suitcase rolled closer. I didn't even need to turn around to confirm it. I could feel her presence there, just a step or two behind me, keeping pace with almost comical precision. It was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but once you were aware of it, the intention became obvious. She was waiting for me to open the gate, and then she would slip through right behind me. The exact same trick she had used earlier. Felt the corners of my mouth twitch slightly as the situation finally settled into place in my mind. It was such a small thing, so petty, really, but something about it felt almost poetic, because suddenly I realized I had a choice. I could walk through the gate normally and let her follow me out, or I could make things a little more interesting. The line moved forward slowly, and within seconds, it was my turn. I stepped up to the wide barrier and reached into my pocket for my Oyster card. The reader glowed softly as I tapped it against the sensor, and the gate responded instantly with a friendly green flash and the soft mechanical sound of the barrier unlocking. Behind me, I heard the faint acceleration of suitcase wheels. She was closing the gap, probably thinking she had timed it perfectly, and in that exact moment, I made my decision. I stepped forward through the gate with my suitcase rolling behind me, but instead of continuing straight ahead, I stopped. Not abruptly enough to look suspicious. Just suddenly enough that someone rushing closely behind me would have absolutely no time to react. The moment I cleared the barrier, I planted my feet and began patting my coat pockets like someone who had suddenly remembered they might have forgotten something important. My wallet, my passport, my train ticket, all the things a traveler might reasonably check for in a busy station. Behind me, there was a sudden, chaotic noise, a metallic thud, a sharp electronic beep from the gate, and then the unmistakable sound of someone being stopped mid-stride. I didn't even need to turn around to know exactly what had happened, because the girl who had been trying to slip through the barrier behind me had just run straight into a gate that was now closing, and this time, she wasn't going anywhere. For a brief second after I stopped, the world behind me erupted into a small burst of chaos. The barrier, which had opened for my paid exit, had already begun sliding shut again the moment I cleared it. Normally, someone tailgating would slip through within a fraction of a second before the sensors registered anything unusual. But by stopping right where I did, with my suitcase and body blocking the natural flow of movement, I had intentionally destroyed that timing. The girl behind me had clearly expected me to keep walking. She had been moving quickly, almost glued to my heels, ready to slip through the moment the barrier opened. Instead, she suddenly found herself running straight into a closing gate that had no intention of letting her through. The result was instant and awkward. I heard the wheels of her turquoise suitcase bump sharply against the floor as she halted mid-step, followed by the quick mechanical clap of the barrier closing in front of her. There was a sharp electronic beep from the gate system, the kind that usually signals that something has gone wrong. It wasn't particularly loud, but in that confined station space it felt noticeable enough to draw attention. I kept patting my pockets as if I were completely absorbed in checking my belongings, pretending I hadn't noticed anything unusual behind me. In reality, of course, I was fully aware of every tiny movement happening just a step away. The girl had been caught in the most awkward position imaginable. Because she had tried to rush through directly behind me, she had already stepped partially into the barrier space when the gate shut. One of the panels had closed right in front of her while the other blocked the space behind her, leaving her awkwardly half inside the exit gate with her suitcase jammed slightly sideways. It wasn't painful or dangerous, but it was definitely embarrassing. The gate system had done exactly what it was designed to do: stop someone who hadn't paid from slipping through. For a moment, there was complete silence behind me. Then came the frustrated sigh. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath, clearly not expecting the situation she had just landed herself in. I finally turned slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder like someone who had only just realized something strange had happened. And there she was, frozen awkwardly in the gate, one hand gripping the handle of that bright turquoise suitcase, the other resting on the barrier panel as she tried to figure out how to move without setting off more alarms. Her expression had completely changed from the calm confidence she had earlier. Now there was a mixture of irritation and sudden uncertainty on her face. The casual swagger she had shown when cutting the line earlier that morning had disappeared entirely, and that was when the second problem arrived, because the underground staff had noticed. Stations always have employees nearby, usually standing near the barriers to help passengers with tickets or deal with technical issues. The small beep from the gate combined with someone getting stuck halfway through it had caught their attention immediately. I saw him approaching from the corner of my eye, a middle-aged station worker in the familiar Transport for London uniform, walking calmly but directly toward the situation. His pace wasn't aggressive, but it had the unmistakable purpose of someone who had seen this exact scenario many times before. The girl noticed him too, and the shift in her body language was immediate. Suddenly, she wasn't just annoyed anymore. She was nervous. She tried to wiggle forward slightly, as if hoping she could somehow squeeze through the barrier before he reached her, but the system had already locked again. Without tapping a valid ticket, that gate was not going to open. The employee reached the barrier and stopped beside her, his expression calm but observant. He glanced at the gate, then at her, then briefly at the suitcase wedged awkwardly against the barrier panel. "Having a bit of trouble there?" he asked in a neutral tone. It was the kind of question that technically sounded polite, but clearly carried another meaning underneath. She straightened slightly and attempted a casual shrug, the kind people use when they're trying to play something off as a harmless mistake. "Yeah, I think the gate just closed too quickly," she said, forcing a small laugh. "I was right behind someone and it just sort of shut." The employee didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the gate again, then at the card reader, then back at her. There was a long moment where he simply observed the situation, clearly putting together exactly what had happened. And to be fair, it didn't require much detective work. People tailgating through barriers without paying wasn't exactly a rare event on the underground. In fact, it probably happened dozens of times a day. The difference this time was that she hadn't quite made it through, which meant the evidence was literally standing right in front of him. "Did you tap out?" he asked calmly. The girl hesitated. Just a tiny pause. But it was enough. "I must have missed it when I came in earlier," she replied quickly. "Maybe my card didn't read properly." I had to bite the inside of my cheek slightly to keep from smiling, because I knew exactly what had happened earlier. And judging by the station worker's expression, he had a pretty good idea too. He gestured toward the reader beside the gate. "If you've got your card, just tap it there and we'll get you through." Another pause. This one longer. Her hand hovered near her bag for a moment, but she didn't reach inside. Because of course there was nothing to take out. She hadn't used a card. She hadn't paid. And now the small lie she had just told was collapsing right in front of her. Behind her, a couple of commuters had begun to slow slightly, curious about the delay at the gate. Nothing dramatic, just the natural human tendency to glance toward a small public problem unfolding nearby. The girl shifted uncomfortably. I think I might have left it in my other bag," she said weakly. The station worker nodded, slowly, clearly not buying the explanation. "Right," he said calmly. "Well, let's sort that out then." Meanwhile, I finished my little performance of checking my pockets and finally gave a satisfied nod to myself as if confirming everything was in place. Wallet, passport, ticket, all present and accounted for. Perfect. Without another word, I gently pulled my suitcase forward and stepped away from the barrier. As I walked toward the station exit, I could still hear the conversation behind me beginning to shift into the familiar tone of someone being politely but firmly questioned by transport. Staff didn't turn back again. But as I reached the escalator leading up toward the street, I did hear one final thing drifting through the station noise behind me. A very frustrated voice, followed by a couple of very creative swear words. And I couldn't help smiling slightly to myself, because sometimes revenge doesn't require shouting or confrontation. Sometimes all it takes is stopping for a few seconds to check your pockets. As I pulled my suitcase away from the barrier and began walking toward the escalator, I could still feel the faint tension of the situation lingering behind me, like the echo of a small explosion that had just gone off. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but there was definitely a ripple of attention spreading through the nearby commuters who had witnessed the awkward scene at the gate. People in London rarely stop completely when something unusual happens, but they absolutely notice. A quick glance, a raised eyebrow, a subtle shake of the head. That's usually the extent of public reaction, and this situation was no different. A few passengers slowed slightly as they passed the barrier, curious about why someone had become stuck halfway through the exit gate, but most continued moving along without interfering. Everyone has somewhere to be. Behind me, however, the situation was becoming much less comfortable for the girl with the turquoise suitcase. I could hear her voice clearly now, strained with frustration as she tried to explain herself to the station employee. There was an edge in her tone that hadn't been there earlier when she confidently slipped through the entrance barrier that morning. Back then, she had carried herself with the quiet arrogance of someone who thought they had outsmarted the system. But that confidence had cracked the moment the gate closed in front of her. "I told you, I think the reader didn't scan when I came in," she was saying, her voice slightly defensive now. "I walked through behind someone and it just didn't register." The employee responded with the calm patience of someone who had probably heard this exact excuse dozens of times before. "That's why we usually recommend tapping your card directly on the reader," he said evenly. "It makes sure the system logs your entry." There was another pause. I imagined her shifting awkwardly in place, realizing that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself with a simple shrug and a quick apology. Because now the employee was standing directly beside the barrier, and the gate itself had locked again, waiting for a valid card tap before it would open. And she didn't have one. At the base of the escalator, I slowed slightly as I maneuvered my suitcase onto the moving step. The metallic staircase carried people upward toward the exit hall and the daylight beyond, but the conversation behind me was still faintly audible over the rumbling machinery. "Do you have an Oyster card or contactless payment?" the employee asked. There was a long hesitation. Then came the reluctant answer. "Not on me." Even from several meters away, I could almost feel the silent moment that followed. That was the moment when the explanation stopped sounding like a misunderstanding and started sounding like exactly what it was. Fare evasion. Transport for London employees are trained to deal with situations like that professionally. They don't shout, and they don't create scenes unless absolutely necessary, but they also don't ignore it when someone is clearly trying to bypass the system. "I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment," the employee said calmly. "We'll sort out the correct fare for your journey." That sentence alone carried enough meaning to make anyone uncomfortable. Because sorting out the correct fare on the Underground rarely means just paying the ticket price you skipped. There are usually fines involved, paperwork, sometimes even identification checks depending on the situation. And judging by the tone of her voice when she responded, the girl had just realized that. "Oh, come on," she snapped, frustration breaking through her earlier attempt at casual indifference. "It's literally one stop. I was just following the person in front." The employee didn't raise his voice. If anything, he sounded even calmer now. "Yes, and unfortunately that means you didn't pay for your journey." There was a sharp exhale from her, the kind people make when they know they've been caught but still want to argue their way out of it. Meanwhile, the escalator carried me higher toward the station exit, gradually lifting me out of earshot. The noise of the station below faded as the sound of street traffic above grew louder, buses rumbling past, distant car horns, and the muffled hum of London continuing its busy day. But even as I stepped off the escalator and rolled my suitcase toward the final set of doors leading outside, I couldn't help replaying the moment in my mind, the way she had confidently slipped through the entry barrier earlier, the way she had hovered right behind me at the exit gate, clearly expecting to use me again to avoid paying, and the exact instant when the gate closed. It had all happened so quickly, but the satisfaction lingered longer than I expected. Not because it was some grand act of revenge, far from it. In the grand scheme of things, it was an incredibly small moment. A commuter stopping to check her pockets, a fare dodger getting stuck in a barrier, a station employee walking over to investigate. But sometimes small moments feel strangely significant, especially when they remind you that actions have consequences. I stepped outside onto the busy London street, the cool afternoon air immediately replacing the underground chill of the station. People hurried past on the pavement, taxis moved through the traffic lights, and the city continued functioning exactly as it had before. To everyone else around me, it was just another ordinary moment in another ordinary day. But as I adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle and began walking toward my next destination, I couldn't help smiling slightly to myself. Because somewhere back inside that station, a girl with a bright turquoise suitcase was probably explaining to a transport officer why she hadn't paid for her journey and all it had taken to put her in that situation was a perfectly timed pause. By the time I stepped fully out of the station and onto the pavement, the whole incident was already fading behind me, swallowed by the constant movement of the city. London doesn't pause for anyone's problems. The streets were alive with the usual rhythm of the afternoon, buses rumbling past the curb, pedestrians weaving through each other with practiced precision, the distant sound of sirens somewhere further down the road, and the steady murmur of thousands of conversations blending into a kind of urban background noise. People hurried past with coffee cups in hand, office workers checked their phones while walking, and tourists stood near the corner studying a map with the slightly overwhelmed look that London tends to give first-time visitors. For everyone else, around me, it was just another normal moment in the middle of a busy day. But for me, there was a quiet little sense of satisfaction sitting comfortably in the back of my mind. Adjusted the strap of my laptop bag on my shoulder and started walking toward the next station, where I would catch the train for my Eurostar connection. The suitcase wheels rolled smoothly along the pavement behind me, and with every step I felt the tension of the morning slowly dissolve. My meeting had gone well, my schedule was back on track, and I still had plenty of time before my departure. Yet my thoughts kept drifting back to the same image, that turquoise suitcase. It was funny how one small detail could stick in your mind like that. Out of everything that had happened during the commute, the crowds, the train ride, the rush through the station, that bright suitcase had become the symbol of the whole situation. The moment I saw it again on the platform earlier, something had clicked in my brain instantly. And that's when the idea had formed. Not some elaborate revenge plan, not some dramatic confrontation, just a moment. A simple decision to stop walking for a few seconds. The more I thought about it, the more amusing the whole thing became. Because technically speaking, I hadn't done anything wrong at all. Hadn't accused her of anything. I hadn't confronted her. I hadn't even spoken to her. All I had done was exactly what any traveler might reasonably do after stepping through a ticket barrier. Pause briefly to check that I still had all my important belongings. Wallet, passport, train ticket. Perfectly normal behavior. The only difference was that someone behind me had been relying on me to keep moving, and when I didn't, well, the system had taken care of the rest. As I walked, I found myself wondering what had happened after I left. Transport staff are generally fair but firm when it comes to fare evasion. At best, she would probably have been required to pay a penalty fare along with the price of the journey she skipped. At worst, depending on how the conversation went and whether she cooperated, it could have turned into something even more uncomfortable involving paperwork and identification checks. Either way, it certainly wasn't the quick, effortless exit she had expected when she started following me through the station, and that was the part that made the moment so satisfying. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, it was just balance. She had cut the line. She had slipped through the entrance gate without paying. She had tried to use another stranger to sneak out of the station the same way. And for a brief moment, the system she thought she had beaten simply refused to cooperate. Sometimes karma isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet little mechanical gate sliding shut at exactly the wrong time. By the time I reached the next station entrance for my onward journey, the whole thing had turned into a small, private joke in my mind. I tapped my card at the barrier, walked through without any trouble, and made my way toward the platform where my next train would arrive. The rest of the day went smoothly. My connection was right on time. I boarded the Eurostar without any delays. And soon enough, I was watching the London skyline fade behind the train window as we sped toward the next destination on my work trip. But every now and then, during the journey, that moment in the station replayed itself in my memory again. The sudden stop, the beep of the gate, the confused frustration in her voice. And I couldn't help smiling slightly every time I thought about it. Because sometimes the smallest acts of petty revenge end up being the most satisfying ones. Would I call it life-changing? Not even close. Would I admit it was a little petty? Absolutely. But if I ever found myself in the exact same situation again, with someone trying to sneak through the barriers behind me after skipping the fare, I'd probably do the exact same thing, without hesitation. Because if you're going to cut the line and dodge the system, you should probably make sure the person in front of you isn't about to stop walking. And that's the story of how one bright turquoise suitcase, one impatient commuter, and one perfectly timed pause turned an ordinary underground journey into the most quietly satisfying moment of the day. If you enjoyed this story, and that little moment of karma felt just as satisfying to you as it did to me, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more revenge stories just like this one. And I'm genuinely curious. Have you ever witnessed someone try to cheat the system and get caught in the act? Or maybe you've had your own small moment of perfectly timed revenge. Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of the best stories might even end up featured in a future video. Until next time. Remember, sometimes the quietest revenge is also the most satisfying.